Two of the biggest names in hip-hop, two shocking murders, and a mystery that has remained controversial for decades. In September 1996, Tupac Shakur was fatally wounded in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas. Just 6 months later, Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G., was murdered in Los Angeles. Their deaths came during one of the most intense periods in hip-hop history, when the rivalry between the East Coast and West Coast rap scenes and between their record labels had become increasingly hostile. But were the two murders connected? Over the years, investigators, journalists, former associates, and fans have proposed competing theories about what happened. Some focused on the rivalry between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Entertainment. Others pointed toward gang conflicts, individuals close to the artists, or alleged corruption within law enforcement. The FBI itself investigated aspects of Biggie's murder, and its released files document the intense rivalry surrounding the two artists. Yet despite years of investigation, no one has been convicted for either murder. So what really happened? Was this simply the devastating result of a violent rivalry, or was there a much larger conspiracy operating behind the scenes? To understand the theories, we have to go back to where the story began. Before Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. became symbols of one of the most famous rivalries in music history, they were actually friends. Their story did not begin with hatred. It began with two young rappers trying to make their names in an industry that was changing rapidly. Tupac Shakur had emerged from the West Coast as an outspoken, unpredictable, and hugely talented artist. Christopher Wallace, known around the world as the Notorious B.I.G., was coming out of Brooklyn and quickly becoming one of the most important voices in New York hip-hop. Their careers were developing on opposite sides of America, but they eventually met through the music industry. At first, there was mutual respect. Tupac had already established himself as a major star, while Biggie was still climbing toward the top. The two reportedly spent time together, talked about music, and developed a friendship. But everything changed in November 1994. Tupac traveled to New York and arrived at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. While inside the building, he was shot during an armed robbery. He survived. But the incident changed the course of his life. Biggie and several people associated with him were inside the same studio that night. Tupac subsequently became convinced that people around Biggie knew more about the attack than they were admitting. There was no evidence establishing that Biggie or Sean Combs arranged the shooting. The FBI's released files specifically document that Tupac and people around Death Row believed Biggie had knowledge or involvement, but also note that this belief existed without evidence. That distinction is important, because this is where the story begins, moving from documented history into conspiracy territory. Tupac did not see the shooting as an isolated robbery. He believed he had been betrayed. And from that point forward, his relationship with Biggie was effectively destroyed. While Tupac dealt with legal problems and eventually spent time in prison, Biggie's career continued to rise. His record label, Bad Boy Records, was becoming one of the most powerful forces in East Coast hip-hop. Then Tupac was released from prison and signed with Death Row Records. That changed everything. Death Row was based in Los Angeles and was led by Marion Suge Knight. Bad Boy was based in New York and was led by Sean Puffy Combs. The conflict between the two labels became increasingly personal, and because Tupac and Biggie were the biggest stars associated with the two camps, their personal conflict became a symbol of something much larger. East Coast versus West Coast, New York versus Los Angeles, Bad Boy versus Death Row, Biggie versus Tupac. The media amplified the rivalry. Songs became weapons in the argument. Interviews became opportunities for insults. And every public confrontation seemed to make the situation more dangerous. The FBI's files on Biggie's murder document how tensions between Death Row and Bad Boy had escalated during this period, including public confrontations and violent incidents involving people associated with the two camps. But there was another important factor. These were not simply two record labels competing for album sales. The hip-hop world of the 1990s was closely connected to street culture, personal rivalries, and people with real-world conflicts outside the recording studio. That made the situation much more complicated. And then came September 1996. Tupac was in Las Vegas, attending a Mike Tyson boxing match. After the fight, an altercation occurred involving Tupac's entourage and Orlando Anderson, a member of the Southside Compton Crips and the nephew of Dwayne "Keffy" D. Davis. Later that night, Tupac was riding in a BMW with Death Row co-founder Suge Knight when another vehicle approached. Shots were fired. Tupac was critically wounded. He died 6 days later, on September 13, 1996. For decades, the murder remained officially unsolved, and that uncertainty created enormous space for conspiracy theories. Who ordered the shooting? Who actually carried it out? Was it retaliation for the confrontation in Las Vegas? Was it connected to the wider Death Row bad boy conflict? Or was there another motive that the public never discovered? For years, investigators struggled to answer those questions. But almost 3 decades later, the case finally reached a courtroom. Dwayne "Keffy" D. Davis was arrested in 2023 and charged in connection with Tupac's murder. In August 2026, his trial began in Las Vegas. Prosecutors allege that Davis orchestrated the attack as retaliation for the earlier confrontation involving his nephew. They argue that Davis played a leadership role in organizing the shooting, although he is not accused of being the person who physically fired the fatal shots. Davis has pleaded not guilty. His defense disputes the prosecution's interpretation of his past statements and argues that the evidence does not establish his guilt. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because Tupac's death was only the beginning. 6 months later, on March 9, 1997, Christopher Wallace was attending an event in Los Angeles. He left the event in an SUV. While stopped at an intersection, another vehicle approached. Gunfire erupted. Biggie was fatally wounded. He was only 24 years old. Once again, a legendary rapper had been killed in a seemingly targeted attack. And once again, there was no immediate conviction. 2 of the biggest stars in hip-hop were now dead. Tupac had been killed in September 1996. Biggie had been killed in March 1997. Only 6 months separated their deaths, and the timing was impossible for the public to ignore. Was Biggie's murder retaliation for Tupac's death? Was Tupac's murder connected to the East Coast-West Coast conflict? Were both murders part of the same chain of events? Or were 2 separate criminal acts later connected by the mythology surrounding them? Those questions would follow the hip-hop industry for decades, and the conspiracy theories became even more complicated because investigators examining Biggie's murder encountered allegations involving gang members, record industry rivalries, and even claims concerning members of law enforcement. Some theories pointed toward people inside the music industry. Others pointed toward street conflicts. Some suggested that the murders were connected, and some theories went even further, claiming that powerful people wanted both artists eliminated. But there is a major problem with many of these theories. A theory is not the same thing as evidence. Some claims have been investigated. Some are supported by testimony or documented events. Others are based primarily on speculation, conflicting statements, or information that has never been independently established. And that distinction will matter throughout this story. Because the real mystery isn't simply that Tupac and Biggie died. The real mystery is how 2 artists who once considered each other friends became the faces of a rivalry that consumed hip-hop, and whether that rivalry ultimately played a role in their deaths. To understand the conspiracy theories surrounding their murders, we have to go back to the rivalry itself. Because before there were 2 murder investigations, there was a war for control of hip-hop. And at the center of that war were 2 record labels, Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records. By the middle of the 1990s, hip-hop was no longer a niche movement. It had become a massive cultural and commercial force, and 2 record labels stood at the center of that transformation. On the West Coast was Death Row Records, founded by Dr. Dre, Suge Knight, and other partners. The label had already produced enormous success through artists such as Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. After Tupac joined the label, Death Row gained an even more powerful voice. On the East Coast was Bad Boy Records, founded by Sean Combs. Its biggest star was Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. Both labels were enormously successful, but they represented different sides of a rapidly growing divide. Death Row represented Los Angeles. Bad Boy represented New York. And as their biggest artists became increasingly hostile toward one another, the competition became personal. At the beginning, the conflict was largely musical. Artists released songs aimed at their rivals. Interviews became confrontational. Radio stations and magazines increasingly framed the situation as an East Coast-West Coast battle. But behind the music were real personal disputes. Tupac believed that people connected to Biggie had betrayed him following the 1994 shooting in New York. Biggie and Sean Combs repeatedly denied involvement. Tupac nevertheless became increasingly convinced that the incident was connected to people around Bad Boy. Then came another major turning point. In 1995, Biggie released Who Shot Ya? The song was recorded before Tupac's shooting, according to Biggie and Combs, and they denied that it was written as a response to the attack. Tupac did not believe them. He interpreted the song as a provocation. The disagreement intensified. Tupac responded with increasingly aggressive music and public statements, and his rivalry with Biggie became one of the most public conflicts in popular music. But the conflict wasn't limited to songs. There were confrontations between people associated with the two camps. The atmosphere surrounding hip-hop became increasingly dangerous. And this is where separating fact from later conspiracy theories becomes extremely important. There is strong evidence that Death Row and Bad Boy were involved in a serious rivalry. There is evidence that Tupac and Biggie had become enemies. There is evidence of violent incidents involving people connected to the broader conflict. But that does not automatically prove that either record label ordered the murder of the other artist. That leap is where many conspiracy theories begin. In the months before Tupac's death, his relationship with Death Row had also become complicated. Tupac was increasingly involved in the business and culture surrounding the label. Suge Knight was both his record executive and a powerful figure in his life. At the same time, tensions were growing between Death Row associates and members of rival street groups. This matters because the circumstances surrounding Tupac's death were not simply about music. They involved a mixture of fame, money, personal disputes, gang affiliations, and street retaliation. Then came the night of September 7, 1996. Tupac attended the Mike Tyson fight in Las Vegas. After the fight, an altercation broke out involving Tupac's entourage and Orlando Anderson. According to prosecutors in the current case against Dwayne Davis, this confrontation became the motive for the later shooting. Tupac and Suge Knight subsequently left the area. Later that night, a white Cadillac pulled alongside Knight's BMW. Tupac was shot. He died 6 days later. The murder immediately produced speculation. Some people believed it was connected to the Death Row Bad Boy rivalry. Others believed it was retaliation connected to the Las Vegas confrontation. Still others suspected that people close to Tupac or Death Row knew more than they admitted. For years, none of these theories resulted in a murder conviction. Then, 6 months later, Biggie traveled to Los Angeles. This was significant because Los Angeles was Death Row territory. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry had not disappeared. If anything, the murder of Tupac had made the atmosphere even more tense. On March 9, 1997, Biggie attended a party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. After leaving the event, he was traveling in an SUV. At approximately 12:45 a.m., another vehicle pulled alongside. A gunman fired into Biggie's vehicle. Biggie was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He died shortly afterward. He was 24 years old. And now the two biggest symbols of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry were gone. Tupac, Biggie, dead within 6 months of each other. The coincidence was extraordinary, and the questions multiplied. Was Biggie killed in retaliation for Tupac? Was Tupac killed because of the rivalry? Did street conflicts surrounding the record labels contribute to both murders? Or had the media created a narrative that connected two separate tragedies? Investigators examined many possibilities. The FBI opened an investigation into Biggie's murder, and its released files contain reports concerning allegations of corruption, possible police involvement, gang connections, and the rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy. But an FBI file containing an allegation is not proof that the allegation was true. This distinction is essential. Over the years, documentaries, books, interviews, and internet discussions have transformed individual allegations into elaborate theories. Some theories claim there was a coordinated plot. Others argue that the murders were the consequences of escalating street conflicts. And some people believe the truth lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that the rivalry had become far more than entertainment. Music had become the public battlefield. But behind that battlefield were real people, real conflicts, and real consequences. And when Tupac and Biggie were murdered, the rivalry suddenly became part of a much darker mystery. The question now was no longer, who had the better rapper? It was, who wanted them dead? And perhaps even more disturbing, did the people around them know what was coming? Let's move on to Tupac's final night. What happened? September 7, 1996. Las Vegas was hosting one of the biggest boxing events of the year. Mike Tyson was scheduled to fight Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand. Among the celebrities attending was 25-year-old Tupac Shakur. By this point, Tupac was one of the biggest names in music. He was also at the center of a growing conflict involving Death Row Records, rival street groups, and the increasingly hostile East Coast-West Coast rivalry. But that night, the story took an unexpected turn. After Tyson's fight ended, Tupac and members of his entourage encountered Orlando Anderson inside the MGM Grand. Anderson was associated with the Southside Compton Crips. According to later accounts, the encounter was connected to an earlier dispute involving members of Tupac's group and Anderson. A physical confrontation followed. This moment would become one of the most important pieces of the investigation into Tupac's murder. Why? Because prosecutors now argue that the confrontation provided the motive for what happened later that night. After the altercation, Tupac and his entourage left the MGM Grand. Tupac was riding in a black BMW driven by Death Row Records co-founder Suge Knight. They were heading toward another location in Las Vegas, but they never made it there. At approximately 11 p.m., while the BMW was stopped at a red light near the Las Vegas Strip, a white Cadillac pulled alongside. Someone inside the Cadillac opened fire. Tupac was struck. Suge Knight was also injured. The Cadillac sped away before police could immediately identify the occupants. Tupac was taken to University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. For several days, doctors attempted to save his life. But on September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur died. He was only 25 years old. The murder immediately became one of the biggest mysteries in popular culture. There was no shortage of theories. Some people believed the shooting was retaliation for the earlier confrontation with Anderson. Others believed the East Coast-West Coast rivalry was somehow connected. Some suspected that people within Tupac's own circle knew more than they were saying. And others believed the investigation itself had been compromised. But one name kept returning: Orlando Anderson. Anderson had been involved in the confrontation earlier that evening. For years, he denied killing Tupac. He was never charged with Tupac's murder. Anderson himself was killed in an unrelated gang shooting in Compton in 1998. His death meant that one of the people most frequently connected to the case could never give testimony at a trial. For decades, Tupac's murder remained officially unsolved. Then came a major development. In July 2023, authorities searched a home in Henderson, Nevada, as part of the investigation. The search renewed attention on Dwayne "Keffy D. Davis. Davis was not a random name in the case. He had publicly discussed being present in the vehicle involved in the shooting and had previously described the events surrounding Tupac's death. In September 2023, Nevada authorities arrested him and charged him with murder with a deadly weapon. Davis has pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors allege that he helped organize the attack as retaliation for the confrontation involving Orlando Anderson. But there is an important distinction. Prosecutors do not allege that Davis was the person who actually fired the fatal shots. Instead, they argue that he helped orchestrate the attack. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions in the case. If the shooting was retaliation for a confrontation in Las Vegas, was the murder actually connected to the music industry? Or did the music rivalry simply provide the background against which a separate street conflict unfolded? That question has become central to the conspiracy debate, because there is no doubt that Tupac's life was deeply intertwined with the music industry. Death Row Records was involved. Suge Knight was beside him. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry was dominating headlines. But none of that, by itself, proves that a record executive ordered Tupac's murder. The available evidence points to a much more complicated picture. There were rivalries between artists. There were conflicts between record labels. There were disputes involving street groups. And there was a violent confrontation just hours before Tupac was killed. All of those things existed at the same time. The challenge is determining which of them actually caused the murder. And there is another mystery. Why was Tupac's case allowed to remain unsolved for so long? Was it because witnesses were afraid to cooperate? Was it because investigators lacked sufficient evidence? Or did someone deliberately prevent the truth from coming out? Those questions have fueled conspiracy theories for nearly 30 years. But now, for the first time, the public has the opportunity to hear prosecutors and the defense argue the evidence in court. And whatever happens in the courtroom could change how the world understands Tupac's final night. But there was another tragedy waiting only 6 months away. Because after Tupac's death, attention turned toward his former friend and rival, Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. And in March 1997, Biggie would travel to Los Angeles. He would never return home. The murder that deepened the mystery. 6 months after Tupac Shakur's death, the hip-hop world was still struggling to understand what had happened. Then another tragedy struck. Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G., was preparing for a major return to the spotlight. Unlike Tupac, Biggie had not been involved in a shooting in Las Vegas months earlier, but his name had become permanently linked to the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. He was the biggest star associated with Bad Boy Records. And after Tupac's death, Biggie's position became even more complicated. Tupac had publicly attacked Biggie and Bad Boy before his death. Now Tupac was gone, and Biggie was still alive. Some people feared that the rivalry would lead to retaliation. Biggie's trip to Los Angeles therefore attracted attention. On March 8, 1997, he attended a party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. The event was connected to the Soul Train Music Awards weekend and brought together numerous figures from the entertainment industry. Biggie attended with members of his entourage. For much of the evening, everything appeared normal, but shortly after midnight, the situation changed. Biggie and his associates left the event. He entered a GMC Suburban and began traveling through Los Angeles. At approximately 12:45 a.m. on March 9th, the vehicle stopped at a red light near Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue. A dark-colored sedan pulled alongside. According to investigators, the driver lowered a window and fired multiple shots toward Biggie's vehicle. The attacker then fled. Biggie was critically wounded. He was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but doctors were unable to save him. Christopher Wallace was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. He was only 24 years old. The reaction was enormous. The music industry had barely recovered from Tupac's death. Now Biggie was dead too. Two of hip-hop's greatest stars. Two murders. Less than 6 months apart. And both killings appeared to involve targeted attacks. Almost immediately, speculation exploded. Was Biggie killed because of Tupac? Was his murder retaliation? Had the East Coast-West Coast conflict finally produced its second victim? Or was something else happening behind the scenes? Investigators faced a difficult case. The shooter had escaped. There was no immediate arrest. And the murder occurred in a city where Biggie was visiting from New York. The circumstances naturally led people to examine his connections to Bad Boy Records, Death Row Records, and the wider hip-hop rivalry. But investigators also had to consider other possibilities. Biggie had been a major celebrity. He had enemies. He had business disputes. and he was surrounded by people connected to the entertainment industry and Los Angeles street culture. The investigation therefore developed in multiple directions. One of the most controversial theories involved members of the Los Angeles that there were connections between certain officers and death row associated figures. However, these allegations remained highly disputed. The LAPD rejected the idea that corrupt officers were responsible for Biggie's murder, and no officer was convicted of killing him. The FBI also investigated aspects of the case. Its released files contain reports involving allegations. People have offered different accounts of what happened that night. Some witnesses described a vehicle matching the suspected getaway car. Other accounts focused on possible connections between people associated with death row and individuals in law enforcement. Still, other theories suggested that Biggie's murder was connected directly to Tupac's killing. But despite all these theories, no one has been convicted for Biggie's murder. And that leaves one of the biggest questions in the entire story. If Tupac and Biggie were killed only 6 months apart, could the murders really be unrelated? It is possible. 2 separate murders can happen within a short period without being part of the same conspiracy. But the circumstances were so extraordinary that the connection became almost impossible for the public to ignore. Tupac had been the face of the West Coast. Biggie had been the face of the East Coast. Their rivalry had been one of the biggest stories in music. Then both were dead, and their murders remained unsolved. That combination created the perfect environment for conspiracy theories to grow. One theory claimed that Tupac's murder was connected to Biggie's camp. Another claimed that Biggie was killed in retaliation for Tupac. Another went even further and suggested that people within the music industry had deliberately manipulated the rivalry until it became deadly. But there is a major problem. The existence of a motive does not prove a conspiracy. The existence of a rivalry does not prove that either murder was ordered by a record label. And the fact that both men died within 6 months does not, by itself, establish a connection. To understand why these theories became so powerful, we have to examine something else: the people who stood closest to both artists. Because behind Tupac and Biggie were powerful executives, producers, bodyguards, friends, associates, and street connections. And some of those people would later become central characters in the conspiracy theories surrounding the murders. The next question is therefore not simply who killed Tupac or Biggie. It is, who around them might have had the power, motive, or information to know what was coming. To understand the theories surrounding Tupac and Biggie's murders, we have to look beyond the 2 rappers themselves. The conflict involved powerful record executives, artists, bodyguards, friends, street associates, and people whose lives existed far outside the music business. But this is also where the story becomes dangerous to simplify. Being connected to someone does not mean being responsible for their actions. And being mentioned in an investigation does not automatically mean someone committed a crime. Still, several names became central to the story. On Tupac's side was Marion Suge Knight, the co-founder and head of Death Row Records. Knight was one of the most influential figures in 1990s hip-hop. He had helped build Death Row into a major record label and had become closely associated with Tupac after Tupac signed with the company. Knight was also sitting beside Tupac when the shooting occurred in Las Vegas. He survived the attack. That fact alone made him an important witness. But Knight's relationship with Tupac was complicated. He was Tupac's business partner and one of the most powerful people around him. At the same time, Death Row's rivalry with Bad Boy had become increasingly intense. Knight had publicly attacked Sean Combs and Bad Boy. Tupac had done the same. The 2 men were therefore operating inside an environment where business competition, personal disputes, and street conflicts overlapped. On the opposite side was Sean Combs, then widely known as Puff Daddy. Combs founded Bad Boy Records and was responsible for building Biggie's career. Unlike Knight, Combs was not present when Biggie was killed. But because he was Biggie's record executive, and because Bad Boy was at the center of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry, his name inevitably became part of the larger story. Combs repeatedly denied any involvement in Tupac's shooting or Biggie's murder. There has never been a conviction establishing that Combs ordered either killing. Another important figure was Orlando Anderson. Anderson became closely associated with the Tupac investigation because of the confrontation at the MGM Grand on the night Tupac was shot. Prosecutors in the current case against Duane Davis allege that the confrontation provided the motive for the attack. Anderson was never charged with Tupac's murder. He denied involvement. He was killed in an unrelated shooting in California in 1998. That meant he never faced a courtroom over the allegations surrounding Tupac's death. Then there was Duane "Keffy" D. Davis. Davis has acknowledged being in the vehicle from which Tupac was shot. For years, he discussed his alleged involvement publicly. Those statements eventually became part of the investigation. In 2023, authorities arrested him and charged him with murder in connection with Tupac's death. The prosecution's case is based heavily on the argument that Davis participated in planning the attack as retaliation for the confrontation involving Anderson. Davis has pleaded not guilty. And importantly, prosecutors do not claim that he was the shooter. The question of who actually fired the fatal shots remains central to the case. Then there are the people connected to Biggie's murder. One of the most controversial was former lapped detective Russell Poole. Poole became convinced that Biggie's murder involved corrupt police officers and people connected to death row. He spent years investigating the theory. His claims attracted enormous public attention, particularly after he left the lapped, but the allegations were strongly disputed. No police officer has been convicted of murdering Biggie. The lapped rejected Poole's conclusions, and Biggie's murder remains officially unsolved. Another name that became famous in the investigation was Greg Kading, a former lapped detective who later conducted his own investigation. Kading developed a different theory about the murders. His account suggested that Tupac's killing and Biggie's killing were connected through individuals associated with the two rival camps. But once again, a detective's theory is not the same thing as a court-established fact. That distinction is essential when examining this case. Over the years, different investigators have reached different conclusions, different witnesses have provided conflicting accounts, and different books and documentaries have promoted competing theories. Some theories focus on death row, some focus on bad boy, some focus on gang conflicts, some focus on alleged police corruption. Others argue that the murders were essentially unrelated. And this is why the Tupac and Biggie story remains so difficult. There is no single piece of evidence that neatly explains everything. Instead, there are fragments, witness statements, police reports, interviews, old rivalries, conflicting testimony, and statements made years after the events. Some of those pieces fit together, others do not. And some of the most sensational claims have never been independently proven. But there is one theory that became particularly powerful in the years following both murders: the idea that Tupac and Biggie were victims of a coordinated conspiracy. According to this theory, the rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy was not simply a feud between two record labels. It was allegedly being manipulated by people who benefited from the conflict. Some versions claim the artists were deliberately pushed against one another. Others claim people around the rappers knew violence was coming but failed to stop it. And the most extreme versions claim that powerful figures within the music industry wanted both men eliminated. But how much evidence actually supports those claims? That is where the story gets much more complicated. Because when we separate documented events from speculation, the picture begins to change. And to understand that difference, we have to examine the evidence surrounding the two murders. Not the rumors, not the internet theories, but what investigators actually found. That is where the next part of the story begins. After Tupac and Biggie were killed, theories about their deaths spread almost immediately. Some were based on real events, others were built from conflicting witness statements, and some grew almost entirely from speculation. But because the cases remained unresolved for so long, even theories with little supporting evidence became part of the mythology surrounding the two rappers. The first major theory was simple: Tupac's murder and Biggie's murder were connected. The argument was based largely on timing. Tupac was killed in September 1996. Biggie was killed 6 months later. Both were enormously famous rappers. Both were associated with rival sides of the East Coast-West Coast conflict, and both were killed in shootings that appeared to be targeted. Supporters of the theory argue that Biggie may have been killed as retaliation for Tupac's death. But there is a major weakness. A connection has never been established in court. Biggie's murder remains unsolved, and there is no proven evidence demonstrating that his killing was ordered as revenge for Tupac. The second major theory focuses on death row records. Some people have alleged that individuals connected to death row had reasons to want Biggie dead. The theory became particularly controversial because Biggie was murdered in Los Angeles, a city where death row had enormous influence. Former lapped detective Russell Poole developed theories involving people connected to death row and alleged police corruption. However, those allegations were disputed, and no one connected to death row has been convicted of Biggie's murder. The third theory goes in the opposite direction. It suggests that people connected to Bad Boy Records or the East Coast may have been involved in Tupac's murder. This theory grew partly from Tupac's belief that people around Biggie knew more about his 1994 shooting than they admitted. But again, suspicion is not proof. No court has established that Sean Combs or anyone acting for Bad Boy ordered Tupac's murder, and the current prosecution theory is different. Prosecutors in Nevada allege that Tupac's killing was retaliation for the confrontation involving Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand. That brings us to another theory. Tupac was killed because of a street feud, not because of the music industry. This theory has gained strength because the prosecution's case directly focuses on the events in Las Vegas. According to prosecutors, the confrontation earlier that evening created a motive. The alleged attackers were connected to Anderson, and Dwayne Davis has acknowledged being in the vehicle from which Tupac was shot. If prosecutors successfully prove their case, it would provide a substantially different explanation from the idea of a secret music industry plot. But the trial itself is important. Davis has pleaded not guilty. The prosecution still has to prove its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. So until the court reaches a verdict, those allegations remain allegations. Then there is perhaps the most controversial theory of all: police corruption. Former Detective Russell Poole believed corrupt lapped officers may have been involved in Biggie's murder. His theory received enormous attention because it suggested that the people investigating the murder might themselves have been connected to the crime. The FBI investigated allegations involving police corruption. Its released files contain reports about those claims. But investigators never produced a criminal conviction establishing that an lapped officer murdered Biggie. The theory therefore remains one of the most debated but unproven parts of the case. Then there is another possibility that is often overlooked. Maybe there was no grand conspiracy at all. Maybe the murders resulted from a combination of personal disputes, street conflicts, celebrity culture, and escalating violence. That explanation may sound less dramatic, but sometimes reality is more complicated than the conspiracy. Tupac's final night involved a documented confrontation at the MGM Grand. His murder occurred hours later. Biggie's murder happened in a different city 6 months afterward. There is evidence of a serious rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy. There are documented allegations surrounding police corruption. There are conflicting witness accounts. But there is no single piece of evidence that ties every element together into one proven master plan. And that is the central problem with the conspiracy theories. They often take several real events and connect them into a single narrative. The events themselves may be real. The connection between them may not be. For example, it is a fact that Tupac and Biggie had once been friends. It is a fact that they later became bitter rivals. It is a fact that their record labels were involved in a major feud. It is a fact that Tupac was murdered in 1996. It is a fact that Biggie was murdered in 1997. It is a fact that both cases generated allegations involving people connected to the music industry, and, in Biggie's case, allegations involving law enforcement. But it is not an established fact that one organization ordered both murders. That is the line we have to keep drawing. Because the mystery is compelling precisely because so many questions remain unanswered. And perhaps the most important question is this: Did the East Coast-West Coast rivalry actually cause these deaths? Or did it simply create the environment in which two separate tragedies became permanently connected in the public imagination? To answer that, we need to examine the theory that has attracted perhaps the most attention over the years, the alleged role of corrupt police officers in Biggie's murder. Because if that theory were ever proven, it would completely change our understanding of what happened. And it would mean that the investigation itself may have been part of the mystery. The police corruption theory. Among all the theories surrounding Biggie's murder, few have been as controversial as the allegation that corrupt police officers may have played a role. The theory became closely associated with former Los Angeles Police Department detective Russell Poole. Poole had investigated Biggie's murder and became convinced that there were connections between the killing, people associated with death row records, and corrupt members of the Laptech. His theory was not simply that police had failed to solve the murder. He believed that certain officers may have actually been connected to the crime. That was an extraordinary allegation. If true, it would mean that the investigation into Biggie's murder may have been compromised from the beginning. Poole focused heavily on the relationship between certain officers and people connected to death row. He also examined the activities of former Lapt officer David Mack, who had known connections to individuals associated with death row. Mack became particularly interesting to investigators because of his association with death row-affiliated figures and because he was later convicted in an unrelated bank robbery. But this is where the story requires caution. Mack was never convicted of Biggie's murder, and the existence of a relationship between an officer and someone connected to a record label does not prove that the officer participated in a murder. Poole nevertheless believed the connections were significant. He argued that some officers had motives and opportunities that deserved deeper investigation. His claims eventually became the subject of lawsuits and extensive media coverage. The FBI also investigated allegations involving possible police corruption. Its released files contain reports concerning claims that Lapt officers may have had connections to Biggie's murder. But after examining the allegations, the federal investigation did not result in criminal charges against an officer for Biggie's killing. That fact is crucial. The FBI investigated. The allegations were taken seriously enough to be examined. But the investigation did not establish a prosecutable case proving that police officers killed Biggie. And this is where conspiracy theories often become distorted. A document can show that investigators received an allegation. A document can show that a suspect was investigated. A document can show that an informant made a claim. But none of those things automatically prove the claim. Still, the theory survived. Why? Because Biggie's murder had no conviction. The shooter was never publicly identified in court. And many questions surrounding the investigation remained unresolved. That uncertainty gave the police corruption theory room to grow. Poole eventually left the Lapt and continued publicly discussing his conclusions. He argued that the case had not been properly investigated. His supporters believed he had uncovered something important. His critics argued that his conclusions relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and unverified information. Then another former Lapt detective entered the story, Greg Kading. Kading later led a task force investigating the murders and developed his own theory. His conclusions were different from Poole's. Kading believed the murders were connected through individuals associated with the two rival camps. His theory suggested that Tupac's murder and Biggie's murder were part of a chain of retaliation. But once again, this remained a theory. It was not established through a criminal conviction, and that distinction is perhaps the most important lesson of the entire investigation. There are several competing explanations. One points toward street retaliation. Another points toward the death row bad boy rivalry. Another focuses on alleged police corruption. Another suggests that the two murders were completely separate. Each theory contains pieces that appear compelling. But none has answered every question. And this is why the Tupac and Biggie cases have remained so fascinating for nearly 3 decades. The lack of a definitive answer has allowed different narratives to compete. One person sees the evidence and believes it points toward a conspiracy. Another sees the same evidence and believes it points toward gang retaliation. Someone else believes the media exaggerated the rivalry and helped create a false connection between two murders. The truth may eventually become clearer. Tupac's case is now being tested in court through the prosecution of Duane Davis. Biggie's murder, however, remains without a criminal conviction. And that means the two cases are currently in very different legal positions. We can say that the East Coast-West Coast rivalry was real. We can say that Tupac and Biggie had a complicated relationship that changed dramatically. We can say that both men became caught in an increasingly hostile environment. We can say that Tupac's murder has now resulted in a criminal prosecution. And we can say that first is a legitimate question. The second requires evidence. And after nearly 30 years, that evidence has never produced a definitive court finding connecting the two murders to one coordinated music industry conspiracy. But there is still one major question left. If the conspiracy theory cannot be proven, why has it survived for so long? The answer may lie in something even more powerful than evidence: the mythology of Tupac and Biggie themselves, their friendship, their rivalry, their fame, their sudden deaths, and the fact that neither story ever received the clean ending that the public expected. That may be why the mystery refuses to die. The final truth: what we know, what we don't, and why the mystery survives. After nearly 3 decades, the story of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. remains one of the most debated mysteries in music history. But when we strip away the rumors, documentaries, internet theories, and sensational claims, what are we actually left with? First, there are the facts. Tupac and Biggie were once friends. Their relationship later collapsed amid the 1994 shooting of Tupac, growing personal tensions, and the increasingly bitter rivalry between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records. The East Coast-West Coast conflict was real. The public hostility was real. The business competition was real, and there were genuine violent confrontations involving people connected to the wider conflict. Tupac was then killed in Las Vegas in September 1996. Biggie was killed in Los Angeles 6 months later. Both murders involved shootings. Both investigations generated enormous public attention, and neither case produced a conviction for decades. Those facts alone are extraordinary. But then we reach the theories. One theory says Tupac and Biggie were victims of a coordinated conspiracy. Another suggests that Tupac was killed because of retaliation following the confrontation involving Orlando Anderson. Another focuses on the rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy. Another points toward alleged police corruption in Los Angeles. And another possibility is that the murders were not directly connected at all. The problem is that no single theory has been proven to explain everything. In Tupac's case, the legal picture has changed dramatically. Duane "Keffy" D. Davis was arrested in 2023 and charged with murder. Prosecutors allege that he participated in organizing the attack as retaliation for the confrontation involving Anderson. Davis has pleaded not guilty. His trial began in Las Vegas in August 2026. Whatever the eventual verdict, the proceedings give the public an opportunity to examine evidence under the rules of a courtroom rather than through speculation alone. But Biggie's case remains different. His murder has never resulted in a criminal conviction. The FBI investigated allegations involving possible police corruption and other connections. Former Detective Russell Poole developed his own theory involving corrupt officers and people associated with Death Row. Former Detective Greg Kading later developed another theory connecting the two murders. But neither theory has been established as fact through a criminal conviction. And that leaves us with an uncomfortable conclusion. There may have been more happening behind the scenes than the public ever learned. There may have been people who knew more than they admitted. There may have been information that investigators could never fully verify. Or the explanation may be less elaborate. Two young men became caught in an increasingly violent environment surrounding fame, rivalry, personal disputes, and street conflicts. Tupac's murder may ultimately prove to have been a targeted act of retaliation rather than a music industry conspiracy. Biggie's murder may have resulted from a completely different chain of events. Or future evidence could change what we think we know. That is the reality of unresolved cases. The absence of a proven conspiracy does not mean every question has been answered. But unanswered questions should not automatically become evidence of a conspiracy. And that distinction is perhaps the most important lesson from the Tupac and Biggie story. For years, people have asked, who killed Tupac? Who killed Biggie? Were the murders connected? Did the record labels know more than they admitted? Was the rivalry deliberately pushed toward violence? Did corrupt officials interfere with the investigation? And perhaps the biggest question of all, did anyone in the music industry benefit from the deaths of two of its biggest stars? We still don't have definitive answers to all of those questions. But we do know something else. Tupac and Biggie were more than rivals. They were two artists who helped transform hip-hop into a global cultural force. Their careers were rising at extraordinary speed. Their friendship became a rivalry. Their rivalry became part of a larger cultural conflict, and then both men died before either had reached the age of 26. Their deaths froze them in time. Tupac remains the rebellious voice of the West Coast. Biggie remains the legendary voice of Brooklyn, and the unanswered questions surrounding their murders have become part of their legacy. Maybe that is why the conspiracy refuses to disappear, because people do not like unfinished stories. They want a mastermind. They want a secret meeting. They want a hidden recording. They want one final piece of evidence that suddenly makes everything make sense. But real investigations rarely work that way. Sometimes the truth is buried under conflicting testimony, lost evidence, fear, misinformation, and years of silence. And sometimes the answer is simply not known. So, was there a conspiracy connecting Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G? It has never been proven. Was the rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy real? Absolutely. Were there genuine conflicts surrounding the artists? Yes. Was Tupac's murder connected to the Las Vegas confrontation, according to the current prosecution theory? That is what prosecutors allege, and the case must be decided in court. Was Biggie's murder solved? No. And is there enough verified evidence to say that the music industry ordered both murders? No. That doesn't make the story less disturbing. It makes it more complicated. Because after nearly 30 years, two of the biggest names in hip-hop history remain surrounded by questions that may never receive complete answers. And perhaps the darkest part of the story isn't that conspiracy theories exist. It's that the real events were already extraordinary enough. Two friends became rivals, two rivals became symbols, and two symbols were suddenly gone. The music industry moved on. Hip-hop continued to evolve. New artists emerged. New rivalries replaced old ones. But the names Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. never disappeared. And neither did the mystery. Two murders, one legendary rivalry, decades of unanswered questions, and a conspiracy theory that, whether true or not, may never completely die.